call the roll now, and then she will go right into the invocation.
Yes, sir. I will call the roll. Reed Williams.
Here.
Eloisa.
Here.
Al. Anita. Tony Edwards.
Here.
Andy Castillo. Anne Marie.
Here.
Kurt.
Here.
Dana.
Here.
Dee Dee.
Here.
Jack.
Here.
Jim.
Here.
John.
Here.
Michael Kinnick.
Present.
Michael Sanchez. Norm. Dr. Finney.
Present.
Peter.
Here.
Seymour.
Present.
And Wayne.
Here.
All right. So I will now do the invocation. We come before you today to give you honor and praise. Thank you for every gift that you have given. We thank you for the opportunity to come and gather today. We ask for your hand of blessing on this meeting of the CPS Energy RAC. We ask that you guide and direct our meetings so that it is full of wisdom, productivity, and respect for one another. Thank you for helping us to accomplish our work and our goals this day. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Ann. Let's now, we'd like to turn it over to our Vice Chair, Ms. Janie Gonzalez. She'd like to address the group here this evening. Thank you very much for being here.
Not a problem. Thank you, everybody. Let me know if you can hear me, but I want to start first by thanking our Chair, Reed Williams, and our Vice Chair, Eloisa Portillo, and the core members of RAC for volunteering to undertake this important work. I know I have not had the opportunity to participate. As you know, CPS likes to keep me very busy, and they have me very busy. And so I again want to just do a special shout out to all of you for all the work that you're doing. I also would like to thank Paula. I want to thank her for her continued leadership and vision for affordability, reliability, and resiliency for the communities that we serve. It's very important. Thank you, Paula. And then again, to the amazing staff at CPS, it has not been easy to coordinate all of us offline and online. And so thank you guys for doing that. Mil gracias, as we say. And again, just finally, I remain confident that we will successfully achieve the RAC's mandate. With these few words, I end with wishing you success in the work ahead. I am available to you via email, video conference, or in call or in person, whichever you prefer. Know that I'm not an absent trustee, that I'm always here available for all of you. And please remain safe and healthy under the current COVID-19 pandemic. It's not easy where we're at again. I know a lot of us are very concerned as employers, as citizens, as volunteers. So again, please remain safe and know that we're here to support you. And that's all I have to say. And I will be here available in case any of you have any questions or want to chat a little longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. We really appreciate your support. Now we'd like to have Ann give us some introduction on the working groups that we've formed and where we're going with those. So Ann, if you'd just pick it up, please.
Yes, sir. So Adrian, if you'll pull up my deck, the one that says working groups and schedule. There you go. Thank you. So you can skip that page and then go to the next one. Go ahead. So first of all, I want to start by saying thank you to all of the RAC members. We have 100% participation in the working groups. So when we kind of first started, we only had around 50, and I know Reed called a couple of y'all, I called a couple, I think Eloisa called a few, and the ones that I talked to, it was like, oh, thank you, yes, I'll be on whatever group you want me to be on. So thank you very, very much. I'm really happy that we got all the participation. So next slide. We do have a couple of ground rules. Because of COVID and where we are and everything, masks will be strongly recommended. The members of the working group can attend in person, but the non-members will give you a link very similar to how the links work for this meeting so that you can participate, but we're just trying to keep the number of people in the room down. The public can attend, but again, they will be encouraged to attend virtually as well. And all the groups will be live streamed for viewing. So if you can't make one of the meetings, you will definitely be able to catch it after a couple of days when we get it up on the website. So next slide. So the first working group will be the CPS Energy current rate process. That one will meet at 10 a.m. to 12, and here's the members. So we get Dr. Femi, Jim, Norm, Kurt, Wayne, and Seymour. So the next group is working group 2. Next slide, there you go, thank you. They're going to work on alternative rates, and that will be Peter, Michael Kinnick, Anita, Tony, Andy, and Al. And then the third group will be the generation planning. They'll meet 3:30 to 5:30, and the members on that team will be John, Anne Marie, Dee Dee, Dana, Jack, and Michael Sanchez. Next slide. So I just wanted to make sure everybody kind of understood when our meetings will be. So tonight we're having our regular committee meeting. The meeting on September 2nd, we will not have, to kind of give you a break from it. So you get no meeting there. Then the 9th will start the working group meetings. The 16th will be our regular committee meeting, and then we'll have the working groups on the 23rd again. And then the 30th will give you a break, and we will not have a meeting at that one. So you get a little bit of a break there from us. And that's all I had. I will now turn it back to you, Reed, or I can turn it to Chad.
Well, no, let's just a couple of comments on the working groups. I thank Ann very much for putting this together. I think we've got everybody pretty much on a group that they wanted, or at least they were willing to serve on. I understand that this is a big time commitment, and if people cannot attend a meeting, it's fine. We understand that. We appreciate the people that are and can attend, and if you can't, just catch up watching the video. We will again have this open to the public, and while with the COVID, particularly this Delta variant, really we're kind of running through our communities, we do need to keep the size down. But if individuals from the community want to come and attend in person, then we're not going to keep them out. And I would see that there's sometimes they might very much want to do that when they have a particular subject that they need to discuss. And we are a committee that's set up to take public input. And I hopefully that this process of having these working groups will facilitate that. Now, on an ongoing basis, we've given you the schedule for September. We're going to kind of keep the schedule open for October to see how the first month works. And if we do fill up all of the time, then we'll continue at this. But hopefully we can get this down to a working group one time a month, and then a committee meeting one time a month. But right now, with the pending activity that we see probably coming with the rate increase, we need to have 2 working group meetings to get started in September. But we will not just have meetings to take up your time. So if the meeting is productive and we've got something to do, we will. If not, we won't. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chad for our last educational session. And in doing that, I want to thank he and his whole team for everything that they've done over the last 3 months to help get us all on the same page and speaking the same language. So with that, Chad, are you there?
I am here. Thank you very much, Chair Williams. Appreciate it. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Happy to be on the phone and in the room virtually with you. I think we have some good content tonight. It is more educational content, but it really is some critical information for you to understand how and when and why we will need a rate case. Now, this information is not the justification and support for a rate request. It's our most recent budget, but it's a process discussion on how we get there. And you may be very happy to know that tonight you don't have to listen to me for an hour and a half. I have two of my colleagues here with me, and they're going to speak about parts of the budget process also. The first is Julie Johnson. She's our interim VP of Capital Markets, and so her team is responsible for funding our business and our investments and our expenditures. I also have Shannon Albert here with me tonight. She is our Vice President of Accounting, and she also has a budgeting team. And so between the two of them, they have a lot to do with this whole budgeting process that we're going to go through tonight. So thank you, ladies, for joining me and giving me a little bit of a breather this evening. Okay, Adrian, go ahead and flip to the next slide, please. All right, quick objectives. I'm going to recap a little bit of our conversation from 2 weeks ago. I promise I won't hit things too hard that we've already talked about. I'm going to just summarize a few key points. Then the next section of tonight's presentation is an example of how our misaligned rates can create problems financially speaking. We've talked about fixed and variable costs, and we've said that they're a problem, but we haven't really shown you what happens when it really does create a problem. So we're going to do that tonight. And then lastly, and this is where Julie and Shannon will take over, we're going to talk through this budgeting process. One of the things we talked about last meeting was what is a cost of service and what isn't a cost of service. And we talked about some terms and some terminology, and we're going to underscore and reiterate those terms and terminology tonight because they're really important for us to all be on the same page. The budgeting process has two pieces. It's got expected revenue, which we also call the revenue forecast. You may also see it referred to as sources of revenue. That's one half of it. The other half is the expected costs. Both of these are forward-looking. The expected costs you may hear referred to as uses of revenue or revenue requirements. That's the phrase that I want you to start using and picking up, because that's when it comes to rate requests, we will compare our revenue forecast with our revenue requirements and see if those match up, okay? So we'll talk through exactly how that works tonight. Slide 3 is just a quick agenda. It essentially flows how I just stated. We'll talk highlights from the last presentation. I'll talk about how cost shifting can happen with our rate structures. I'll circle back actually to some integrated planning slides at the very end. And then we'll spend the bulk of the meeting on the budgeting topic for this evening. So slide 4, I ended last meeting with some verbal comments about sort of the takeaways from the meeting. And I had jotted them down at the last minute and didn't have time to include a slide. But I put them on a slide this time so that you have them and you can keep them. The cost of service study is backward looking. We don't use it to actually define our forward-looking costs. That's a separate process called revenue requirements, and that is what we're going into tonight. So we looked at the cost of service, which was backward looking. Tonight we're going to be forward looking. When it comes to cost, the usage patterns of our customers are really what creates differentiation in cost structure. Our inefficient customers, they disproportionately create fixed costs, while our efficient customers, they make a much better use of our fixed cost infrastructure. We talked about how our commercial customers pay a little bit more than their cost of service, and the residential customers pay a little less than their cost of service. We also talked about our rate designs and how they don't align to our cost structure in most cases. And we talked a lot about effective price, which is just the sum of an entire bill divided by the number of kilowatt hours purchased in that bill. And it's not a great indicator of fairness, of who is paying which prices and is that fair or not, because the efficient users will often have a lower effective price, but they're contributing more than their cost of serving, our cost of serving them. A lower effective price doesn't necessarily mean that we're not creating some type of incentive for energy conservation. In fact, when we looked at our rates, when we looked at our rates, every single rate that we have has some type of conservation price signal to it. That is something we hold very valuable and is very important to us. And so every single rate has some element of a conservation price signal. Okay, Adrian, go ahead and flip to the next slide. This is where, at the beginning of the last meeting 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that Ann and I had a conversation with Dr. Femi, and I had kind of a light bulb moment on how to talk about cost of service versus budgeting. And I spent a little bit of time talking about what a cost of service is versus what a cost of service is not. I've put that on a slide for you this time. So it's one of the things that I think is important to reiterate. The cost of service study it's a snapshot. At a point in time, it takes a picture of our cost structure, and that point in time is in the past. It's backward looking. It's a study of how the customers create costs and then how they contribute to covering those costs. And we use it to inform rate design. It doesn't actually set the price. It just informs the rate, the design of the rates, and the fairness of the rates across our different customer segments. It is not, on the right-hand side of the slide, used to determine our revenue requirements. Okay, that's the funding that we need to run the business. And this is an interesting distinction here, because when we make a rate request, or you hear in the news, CPS Energy is doing a rate case, they're increasing rates. To me, that has kind of a negative connotation to it. What we're really doing is identifying the fact that we need more funding to continue to deliver electric and gas service to the community. And then that translates itself to, well, how do you get more funding? Well, yeah, you have to increase the prices to get that. But underneath that, what's really happening is we require more revenue to fund the business, to run the business, to deliver electric and gas service. It's not, the cost of service study is not forward-looking. We have another process for that. That's the process we're doing tonight. The cost of service study is not by itself an indicator of needing a rate increase. The process we're talking about tonight is that process. And then we talked about how it's not a driver of the price that's actually charged to the customers. That's the revenue requirements process. Okay, so I've beat a dead horse, and I've told you what it isn't and what it is, and I've said that tonight is all of the things that a cost of service isn't. Okay, slide 6, please, Adrian. All right, I will be very fast on this slide. This is my effective price slide, where we talked about the smaller customers that use our system very inefficiently. They are very infrequently at their peak of usage, but they do have a peak. They're inefficient. Their utilization, what we call our load factor, is roughly 40%, and they have a higher effective price. And then the bigger you are, the more efficiently you use the infrastructure that we've built to serve you. Your utilization goes up, your effective price goes down, and every single one of them has a conservation incentive built into the rate. Okay, next slide, please. Slide 7, this is one of my sort of favorite visuals on how those mechanics work that lead to a lower effective price. The cost of serving is just disproportionate to the volume of kilowatt hours purchased. And so you do the math on the left-hand side, and residential, it will have a 10 to 12 cent effective price, but commercial will have sort of the 7 to 8 cent effective price, simply because they use more kilowatt hours, and if you divide it into more kilowatt hours, then you're going to end up with a lower result. Okay, slide 8, Adrian. This is our first pause, and we will have these again tonight like we have the last several meetings. But let me pause, and first I'm going to look in the chat and see if we have questions.
So the one thing that we have in the chat, evidently we are having technical difficulties with the live streaming, and they are working furiously on it to get it up and running. So I just wanted to let everybody know that.
Okay, thanks, Ann. I appreciate that. So I don't see any questions in the chat. That's the stuff we all talked about last time, so that doesn't surprise me, I guess. Any verbal questions anybody wants to talk about before we keep going?
Chad, very quickly, I'm trying to let me see what I'm trying to do here. On your slide 5, which is, I think, very, very informative. It's almost like what you put up and, keep at the back of your mind and refer to it every time you're not sure where you are. It's almost like a little roadmap. But please clarify something. When you talked about expected costs, which is your uses of funds, are you saying that is the revenue requirement?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to write something in the chat here. Expected cost equals budget equals revenue requirements. Okay, making sure I spell everything correctly. That would be embarrassing. So those are the terms that we use when we're looking forward, right? Our expected, something you expect, of course, is in the future, right? So our expected costs, our budget, our revenue requirements. It sounds funny to call something that's our expected cost our revenue requirements, but when you think about it, how I just described our funding needs, we run our business and it costs money to run the business. We are funded by our community through their bills, through the revenue from their bills. And so our costs determine our funding needs, and our funding comes from revenue, and so our funding needs are the same as our revenue requirements. It's a little wacky, but that's how to think about it.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, let's press on. Adrian, go ahead and flip to slide 10, if you would. So this is exactly the same slide you saw 2 weeks ago. Not going to spend much time on it, but the top is revenues, the bottom is the costs. Within revenues and costs, you got your fixed and your variable on the left-hand side. So your white is fixed revenues, gray is variable revenues, white is fixed costs, gray is variable costs, and you can see the percentages between the classes and between the two types of costs. Slide 11 is just the visual depiction of that relationship. So Adrian, go ahead to slide 11 if you would, please. There you go. This is a slide, I think this is the third time you've seen this slide. It's the same numbers that was on the prior slide. It's just some people are visual learners and some people look at numbers and tables and understand better, so I wanted to give both. Now, I said that what we're going to do tonight is share an example of how this mismatch can hurt. So turn to slide 12, please. Okay, this is a hypothetical example, but it is based in fact. On the far left, let's start on the left-hand side. This is a depiction of the cost of serving a residential customer. The average cost of serving per month is about $120, and that's real. That's an approximate number, but within $5 either way, that's accurate, okay? $120 a month, and that's, if you average their bills across a year, it's accurate. Within that, right, the prior slide said 40% variable cost. Well, that's about $50. So then the 60% is fixed cost. So every month, when I send a $120 bill, the costs I'm recovering, about $50 are variable cost of producing the kilowatt hours at my generation plants. And the other $70 is the fixed cost of the infrastructure, the plant itself, the transmission, the distribution, all of that infrastructure is fixed costs. But that is mismatched with our revenue, right? I think on the prior slide, it was 7% fixed cost, 93% variable cost. This is how it shakes out on a bill. So the bill is 120, but the variable revenue is $111. And so in this example, our average monthly kilowatt hour usage for our residential customers is about 1,060 kilowatt hours. And we have what we refer to as energy charges. That's the price per kilowatt hour. And this customer paid roughly 10.5 cents times the 1,000 or so kilowatt hours. And that part of their bill was $111. And then the rest of the bill was the fixed, what we call fixed revenue. That's just the monthly charge of $8.75 or $9 when you round it. And so, look, as long as I can predict exactly how many kilowatt hours or even roughly how many kilowatt hours my customers are going to use. And as long as that is relatively consistent, then honestly, I don't care if I'm recovering my fixed costs and my variable charges. Because as long as they're using, what I thought they were going to use, that means I've designed the rate in a way that gets me all of my costs with what I thought they were going to use. But the right-hand side of the slide is where a problem comes in. And this is an example of somebody that gets rooftop solar. And there are many, many, many advantages to rooftop solar. What we're looking at now is sort of a technical forensic financial analysis, and that's it. Okay, so there's other sides of the story, and I want to freely acknowledge that. But the nuts and bolts of cost recovery, this is the picture. So when a customer gets solar installed on their roof, generally their usage goes down by about 70%. Because the solar system is generating a lot of kilowatt hours for them to use. And they're sized that way intentionally because the ratio of the roof space to the energy consumption they use, it typically works out that, that their usage of kilowatt hours from us goes down about 70%. The bill in this case is $40. It's 300 kilowatt hours times that same energy price of about 10.5 cents. So the variable piece of the bill went down to $31. Well, it makes sense that it should go down, right? Because they used 700 fewer kilowatt hours, but it went down what, 80%, 70%, something like that. So it went down to $31, that side of the bill. You still had the fixed revenue piece was $8.75, so $9. So the total bill is about $40. The fixed cost of serving this customer has changed a little bit, but not much, because the load profile of solar generation is just slightly mismatched to our system peak. And so the peak of solar generation happens a little bit earlier than our system peak. Solar does bring down the customer's peak, their peak demand, but only by a little bit is what we find. And so when you add in sort of the roughly the same fixed cost of $70 plus about $10 to $15 of variable cost to generate that 300 kilowatt hours, you can see the little dashed line on this chart. The fixed cost of serving is a little over $70. The total cost of serving them is probably about 90, maybe 85 or 90. And so that right there is the challenge that every utility on the face of the earth is trying to solve. Because somebody comes along and sells rooftop solar to a customer, and part of that sales pitch is the 70-ish% reduction in an electric bill. And that's wonderful for that customer, but the utility doesn't experience a commensurate 70% reduction in the cost of serving them.
So can I ask a question here? So why do you subsidize something like that?
Well, so let's get into that in the generation strategy workshop. I think
You can't answer it like right now?
There's various reasons. I mean, we incentivize sustainability in our community. We've done that at the request of the community. The community voted and approved through their council members 12 years ago our STEP program. Through that STEP program.
Did you show the council members this slide?
Well, so 12 years ago, we didn't know enough about how these mechanics worked to be able to predict this and show them this. But we have it now, and we're talking about the next generation of our generation strategy, right? So we've learned a ton. We have had a tremendous impact on sustainability here in the city, in our community. But what I'm showing you is, yes, there is a cost to that. And so what we're doing through this process, right, through the RAC process, is we're creating that visibility so that there's input, there's transparency, and we can make balanced decisions. Okay, so let's keep going to the next slide. Slide 13. So Dr. Femi has brought up a couple of times this view of a timeline and the implications of fixed and variable costs through time. And so, Dr. Femi, this is my attempt, and it actually is a very, very fascinating view. So let me explain what you're looking at here. Down the left-hand side, the y-axis is dollars, right, as you see. Across the bottom is months. So this is a year. It's a year worth of bills and costs. The fixed cost of serving a customer is set in the summer, right, at their summer peak. But since we designed the system to meet their peak and it's that way all year long, it's reasonable to say their fixed costs are the same every month. Okay, it's just sort of a flat line every single month. The variable cost of serving them, which is the blue line, well, that changes each month as the seasons ebb and flow. Sometimes they use fewer kilowatt hours and sometimes they use more kilowatt hours. And when they use more, the variable cost of serving them goes up. The bill, however, is depicted with the dashed line on this chart. And what it's showing is that there are many months in the year where the bill is actually a negative margin, right? It's actually not fully covering the cost of serving the customer. It's covering the fixed costs, but it drops a little bit below the variable cost. Then you got 4 months in the middle there, June, July, August, and September, where the bill goes above the total cost to serve. So that area, and I wish I had a pointer that I could point, but the area underneath the dashed line that's above the blue line in the middle of the chart there, that area pays for the areas between the dashed line and the blue line all other times of year. So why is that? Like you're probably sitting there thinking, why on earth do we do that? You know, why do we charge customers more in the summer? Well, energy efficiency incentives, right? We talked last time about our peak capacity charge. That has an impact. That works to lower the total system cost and makes us all more efficient. It does create more seasonality in the bills, but overall it's balanced. So that's kind of the baseline for a typical customer, residential customer, a typical residential customer, and this is only the electric side of their bill. But Adrian, turn to slide 14. This is what happens when you've got a customer that has rooftop solar on our current rate structure, okay? The bill is the dashed line, and you can see it changes throughout the year as they get to summer and actually need some kilowatt hours from the utility. But it never, not in any single month, gets above the total cost of serving them, or even the fixed cost of serving them. And so this is sort of the next part of the story from the bar charts that I showed on slide 12.
So could I continue a little bit with my question? Surely you've seen this slide around, and you know that the people with solar top units are not paying the cost of their service. And so when you are going to eventually ask for a rate increase, doesn't that mean that the rest of us are going to pay for their solar top units after they're already subsidized?
Well, that depends on how we do a rate increase.
I think it's directly bailing them out.
Dana, this is Reed. Yeah, you're right on a point that you're on a committee that's going to work on this, and it's something we've all got to talk about, but it's a very detailed cost. It has to do with what the costs that we're avoiding in the utility and what we're avoiding in capital improvement. So it's quite involved, and you're dead on, and you'll have a lot of time to talk about this in the committees. So
well, I appreciate that, Reed, and and I hope we do.
It's very complicated. If you've got a guy that's got a rooftop solar, and you say, well, what is that avoiding, or what is that cost that we're avoiding? Well, that's complicated to figure out, because you got to think about what units you're running or whether you're buying power. Then it has to talk about how much capital we've saved, because if, let's just say they put 50% up and we put 50% up, we've actually put electrons into somebody's house at 50% in investment. So it is a big, long discussion. It's very complicated. And as I think Corey said on here, this is just the financial look at it. It's not the total look. Sorry to jump in there.
No, I appreciate it. I very much appreciate it. Let's flip to slide 15. So this is our next pause for questions, and I know we got a bunch of them in the chat here. So let me answer a few of these here. What is the current percentage of residential customers with rooftop solar? It's a little less than 5%, maybe 3.5% to 4%. So it is still the vast minority of our customers. It is a lot fewer than utilities like Salt River Project or Arizona Public Service have. And in California, they have a much higher percentage. So now is the time for us to evaluate as a community how we move forward into the future with solar in our community. Is it fair to average all residential customers together, or are there different classes of residential customers which we need to understand? We have 3 classes of residential customers, but one of them is very, very small. They're very large residential users, and we have a class called RCE. These customers have higher demand than typical residential customers, and so they go on a rate that actually has residential demand charges. But we have a few dozen, like maybe 50 to 100 tops. We don't have very many on that. Then we have a rate that's called RA, and this is actually a rate that we don't sign new customers up for. It is tied to premises that are all electric. So residential all electric is RA. They don't have gas, and so their rate is only slightly different. In fact, I don't have it in front of me, but when I show it to you, you'll say, oh yeah, that's not very different. Then we have RE, and like 80% of our residential customers are on RE. That's our primary rate. Now within that class, sure, there's lower users, there's higher users. Generally, there's sort of a bucket in the middle that all look very, very similar. And so what we'll do is part of the working group, not sure which working group, I guess it'll probably be the one in the middle, it'll probably be working group 2. We will share a distribution of usage profiles of the residential customers. And this is a question that has come up in our public comments at the end of a couple of meetings, that are we being unfair by lumping a bunch of customers together? And I would tell you that I think the answer is no. We can't get to a place where we have one rate for every single customer and it differs, you know, the rate design is specifically for each individual customer. That's not practical. We have to lump them together, but it's a fair question to ask, have we lumped them the right way? And are there sub-segments in there that we could pull out if they're driving costs differently? I don't think that there is, and we'll show you that in the coming meetings. Let's see, Dee, does CPS Energy study the benefits of solar, or do you just look at the cost? Dee, I'm gonna have to table that one, because being in finance, I know that we do, but I just can't talk much about it. So that'll be one of the questions we gotta get back to you with. I know my good friend Rick Luna would be able to tell you all about how he and his team study the benefits of solar.
Yeah,
it looks like.
Yeah,
Oh,
I definitely would like to know that, because in some of the comments are like, you know, are being said that we're subsidizing solar because of XYZ costs, but we also need to know, you know, what the benefits are as well.
Yes. Okay, so I'm writing down a note. Sorry for my.
Dee, this is Reed. We're going to get into that with 2 groups. One is the group 1, which is going to be proposing pretty much what we've had, but also group 2, and this comes in with the step and the flex step. because as we develop the new STEP program, that's where that discussion is going to be on group 2. And I know there will be a lot of that. And so it's something that we've got to keep absolutely right in front. And just to answer your question directly, what are some of the advantages? Well, some of the advantages are that that you've lowered the capital to create electrons for somebody. You've also maybe avoided bringing on high cost. And as was said, it doesn't really necessarily line up with exactly the peak time, but sometimes it could. And so it could allow the utility to avoid bringing on expensive units or bringing on purchased power off the ERCOT grid. So there are some advantages, and we'll have to look at those and we'll have to calculate them. Dee Dee, you're right.
And Dee Dee, I see your follow-up question there. Oh,
Sorry.
one moment. So Dee Dee, I see your follow-up question there. Do we have a value of solar study? No, we do not. But my team specifically does spend a lot of time studying other utilities' value of solar studies, which we find is a very economical way of training ourselves to learn about it. The city of Austin Energy has one that they redo periodically, and we have read every page of that. So those are very educational, and those are things that we will talk about in coming weeks. Now, I interrupted somebody or Dee Dee, did you have a comment?
No, that was me.
Okay. Dr. Femi, question, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Reed's comment, and also I believe it was Dana's question about, excuse me, about the subsidy and things like that. Obviously, there's a lot to be discussed, and I'm certainly looking forward to these discussions. Also listening to Working Group 2 as they look at alternatives. But the other thing about solar is that even though the rooftop solar is reducing the amount of kilowatts hours supplied through the grid, the question is what happens when the sun does not shine? They still have to fall back on the grid to meet their needs. And the question is there should there be some type of an insurance cost built into the bills for that ability to still look back to the grid when your solar or rooftop solar does not supply you? I mean, that's something that obviously I've seen and read about in many other utilities and their rate designs. So obviously I'm looking forward to those conversations as well. I do have a question about slide 13, or just a comment, if there's still some time.
Adrian, do you mind flipping back to slide 13, please?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Again, thanks for trying to accommodate some of my comments in previous meetings. I think this is certainly getting almost there to what I had in mind. And I just want to note that this slide does still not have that fixed revenue line, which I think is also important to know. If you look back on slide 12, that's the one that's, I think, comes from the $9 amount, which would be at least in my own slight adjustment to this illustration, is a dotted line somewhere in at least on my chart, I put it at the $30 line. So if we could just imagine that we had a dotted line at the $30 line, that signifies fixed revenue. And this is the question for Chad. If we took what's currently at about $78 and moved that line up to about 100 or 110, I mean, I'm again, hypothetically, you'll see exactly what I meant by the total bill dipping below the fixed cost line, which on slide 13 or 14 is actually the extreme case, but it could still happen, I believe, with our typical residential customers, or could it, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we've shown here is the average view, but not everybody is average. Some residential customers are less efficient than others. In other words, they're very peaky, and their load factors are low. And so in that instance, if somebody has above average demands that they place on the system, then the fixed costs of serving them are more than their peers. And then they very well may have some months where, you know, they're at a very low percentage of their peak and they're not using very many kilowatt hours, and it drops below the fixed cost of serving that particular customer. Yeah, I think that's possible.
But you're not seeing it on an aggregate basis. I mean, do you have any type of historical indication of that happening on the aggregate basis, that is, say for an entire class of customers?
No, I don't. I mean, I feel like, you know, as we analyze our revenue per bill and our cost structure, that's not a prevalent concern. It's not a problem that happens with a whole lot of customers.
Right. Okay. That's just I just wanted to know if that's something that happens on the aggregate basis. Thanks again. I think this is quite a very good illustration, and I appreciate the efforts that you have done and putting into preparing this. Thank you so much.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, let's see. Al, do customers with solar have a non-negotiable power purchase agreement with CPS? No, well, sort of. It depends on how you look at net metering. So a net metered rate is the net of the ins and the outs. So when they are not taking kilowatt hours from us and they are generating themselves, if they generate more than they need, then they have an export of energy. And for every kilowatt hour they export, through net metering, it offsets a future imported kilowatt hour when it's nighttime. And it offsets the full retail price of that kilowatt hour. And so effectively, when they're pushing a kilowatt hour to the grid in the middle of the day at 3 p.m., that kilowatt hour, they're avoiding paying me the 12 cents for that kilowatt hour. But then later, I give them a kilowatt hour for free because of it. And that 12 cents, that 11 or 12 cents, 70% of that's fixed costs, and I don't get a benefit from the kilowatt hour that I get in the middle of the day in a way that offsets my fixed costs. I mean, it's worth about $30 a megawatt hour, 3 cents per kilowatt hour to me, because that's the avoided cost of generating it myself. That's the avoided cost of generating it ourselves. Now, what is it worth to us? That gets into this value of solar conversation that Dee Dee brought up. So Al, that's how I would answer your question. I'm not sure if that's a good enough answer, but.
Real quick, once it goes back into the grid, it's just not held in abeyance in that person's name. I would imagine that it get used to offset some of the high costs going on at that time. And then at a later date, when it's come back the other direction, it's a lower cost to the company.
It is, yes. I mean, typically generating in the middle of the day is more expensive than generating at night, but it's still the variable cost. So if a customer exports a kilowatt hour to me at 3 or 4 o'clock, that might save me $60 a megawatt hour. Could be 50 or 40 or 30, depending on the season. In August, yeah, it might save me $60 a megawatt hour or 6 cents a kilowatt hour from generating it myself. And then I turn around and give it back to them in the middle of the night when temperatures are much cooler and it's easier to generate energy, and the cost of generating energy is 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So yes, there is some sort of cost arbitrage there, but only during a couple of months a year. Okay, you guys are on fire tonight. Lots of very, very good questions. You're really making me work for it tonight. Let's see.
I think you go back to Michael.
Where's Michael's?
It just says my question pertains to slide 12, which we just moved on from.
Okay, where am I missing? How am I missing it? It's up?
It's up, yeah, see.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
All right, Michael. Adrian, would you mind going back to slide 12? And then, Michael, what is your question, sir?
That was already covered a while back. We're good.
Okay. All right, very good. So let's move on. I think we've tackled all the questions in the chat. So at this point, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about that forward-looking side of the budgeting process. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over first to Julie, and she's going to talk about the revenue forecasting part, the first half of the equation. And then she'll turn it over to Shannon, and Shannon will talk about the revenue requirements part of it, the second half of the equation. So Julie, take it away.
Very good. Thank you so much. Good evening, committee members. Now, this is my first time presenting to you, so thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So I'm just going to start off by walking you through some high-level concepts, such as our objective and an overview of the budgeting process. I'll discuss, like Chad said, revenue forecast, and then I'll pass it to Shannon to discuss revenue requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about financial objectives. One important point to understand is that CPS Energy is a cost recovery business. So what does that mean? It means that every dollar we spend on behalf of our community ends up in customers' bills. So our objective is not to generate profit. We only recover what we need to cover operating expenses, capital investments, interest and principal payments to our debt holders, and then the payment to our owner, the City of San Antonio. Next slide, please. So now that we understand our objective, let's talk about the process we go through to develop our budget. Now, this is a process that occurs every single year. So big picture, there are two major pieces to this exercise. We start by developing a revenue forecast. Now, this is a function of price times quantity, and quantity for us is expected sales. Second, we look at our costs. We develop what's called a bottoms-up budget, where we add up all the costs we expect to incur. Our budget determines what level of revenue is needed, or as we'll discuss in a bit, this sets our revenue requirements. Once those two pieces are determined, the formula to analyze the result is as follows. If the revenue forecast is less than our revenue requirements, then we need to find ways to balance the budget. Not unlike our personal budgets, we must sharpen our pencils and look for ways to cut costs and prioritize our requirements. And when those efforts are exhausted, then our option is to increase our revenue by increasing rates. Next slide, please. So this slide may look familiar. This was presented to the board at the July meeting during our request for budget approval. Now, this is just an example of a balanced budget. You will note that our revenue forecast on the left bar equals our revenue requirement on the right bar, and that is consistent with the cost recovery objective. Now, focusing on the bar on the left, you'll see that the largest source of revenue by far is retail electric. This represents a sale of electricity to our different customer segments, including residential, commercial, industrial, and others. Now, other components include distribution gas, wholesale, and non-operating revenue. So because retail revenue is such a large component, in the next section, I'll focus on some of the major inputs that feed into the revenue forecast. Next slide, please.
So this is our first pause for questions and discussion in Julie's section. So any questions or comments, or some of this we've kind of talked through before, but I wanted Julie to reiterate and underscore it. So
This is Jim Berg. In the last slide, there was a city payment. Is that the 14% off the top?
yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and I want to point out that this is the budget that we got approved just this last board meeting for our current fiscal year FY22. And it's important to note that the reason it balances is because we included what we called a provisional rate increase that we thought would be effective late fall, early winter. That piece is needed to make our budget balance this year. And so without that, those two numbers wouldn't be the same. You know, 2.7 billion equals 2.7 billion. And the reason we were able to get a budget approved is because we promised our board that we would bring a rate request to them for their approval separately. So we're not just, obviously, we can't just raise rates without our board and our city council approving that.
Yeah, but Chad, just to read, that revenue requirement didn't cover all the cost, if I remember seeing the budget. Maybe I missed it. Right, you're collecting the revenue requirement, but if I remember looking at the board presentation, the revenue requirement did not cover all the cost.
The revenue requirement is all of the costs, but the revenue forecast without the provisional rate increase does not cover all of the costs. It doesn't, and that's where some of this nomenclature kind of gets kind of off, right?
We can look at that in the working session because we talked about that after the meeting. So, okay, let's go on.
Okay, next slide.
Just one last question. What is R&R in that nomenclature?
It's the repair and
R&R repair and replacement?
Yes, repair and replacement account.
Okay,
And
thank you.
that is intended to fund capital for our system, improvements to our system. Okay. So very good. Okay, so this is a forecasting overview. So this is just, again, a high-level overview of our forecasting process. As we mentioned earlier, this is an annual process. We have a long-range planning team that coordinates this effort. They gather information on all the forecasting inputs from the subject matter experts throughout the company. You'll see some of them listed on this slide. Those forecasting inputs are reviewed, challenged, and agreed upon before they are incorporated in the plan. The end result of this process is a 25-year long-range plan, which is very useful for long-term resource planning. This effort also yields a year-one budget that is then presented to the board for approval. So the outer years are refreshed in subsequent planning cycles and are really considered preliminary. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about the major components of our retail revenue forecast. First, we'll start with the load forecast, which determines our expected sales. In order to develop this forecast, we need the number of customers for each segment, such as residential, commercial, industrial. Assumptions for number of customers are impacted by several factors. One example is projections for population growth in the area. As we've heard, our area is expected to gain approximately 1 million residents over the next 20 to 30 years. And once we've determined the number of customers for each segment, then the next step is to forecast the expected consumption by segment. There are several factors that impact consumption, such as weather and just historical sales. Recently, we have also had to consider assumptions related to remote work activity. As we know, during COVID, we saw an increase in residential sales as more folks were working from home and students were remote learning. And we also saw a decline in commercial as some businesses took a pause during the height of the pandemic. For our commercial and industrial customers, we work very closely with our account managers to determine additions and revisions of larger load accounts. They are kind of the first line of contact to CPS Energy, so they know that information best. Now, the charts on this slide are just for illustration purposes, but they give you an idea of some of the analysis that is performed by segment as we try to determine our load forecast. Next slide, please. So another major component of our retail revenue forecast is fuel. Now, fuel is a pass-through, and that just means that this cost is passed on to our customers through the fuel adjustment, which is an approved mechanism. The fuel forecast is a function of the level of anticipated sales, unit fuel costs, and the mix of the various fuels used to generate electricity. The forecast also includes purchased power sources, including ERCOT market purchases and renewables. So of course, to determine that pricing, we consider, you know, our existing natural gas and coal contracts, and then just expected natural gas prices. We also consider forecasted wholesale market prices for those market purchases. Next slide, please. So the last component of retail revenue that I'll review is the regulatory forecast. Regulatory costs are also a pass-through, and they're recovered through an approved mechanism. The regulatory forecast is primarily made up of transmission costs. In Texas, transmission costs are paid by all transmission participants based on a load ratio share. For us, that percentage is approximately 7%, which means that our load is approximately 7% of all ERCOT activity. In order to forecast regulatory costs, we must consider peak information, not just ERCOT's, but also CPS Energy's. Now, the peaks are measurement points for determining our load ratio share. We also have to have an understanding of other utilities' transmission costs. That's usually determined by a rate case presented to the Public Utility of Texas. Our team monitors case activity to foresee any potential increases related to other utilities that might be headed our way. And then last, the forecast also is impacted by the strategy, by CPS Energy strategy for filing cost recovery applications with the PUC. This sets the fee at which we will recover our transmission costs from others. Okay. Next slide, please. So here we see an example, just the end result. We take all the major components we discussed and we develop a retail revenue forecast for the next 25 years. Just to give you some idea of the magnitude of this component, in fiscal year 22, retail revenue was projected to be approximately 85% of the total revenue forecast. Okay, next page. So just one other component, and so this is the revenue forecast for wholesale revenue. So CPS Energy seeks to optimize the use of our generating assets. Our number one priority, of course, is to serve our customer load, our customers, right, and other contract obligations, but any excess power can be sold into the ERCOT market. So every dollar recovered through wholesale is a dollar that doesn't have to be recovered from our customers. And so without this offset, of course, more pressure is created for our retail customers. So, so to develop this forecast, we consider ERCOT market conditions. One very important factor is the ERCOT reserve margin. So this considers all the available generation available to serve the total anticipated load within ERCOT. So when this reserve is tight, so this provides more opportunities for increased demand and higher prices. And if we are in a long position, and that just means that we have more power than what our community needs, we can sell that excess power on the market for the benefit of our customers. So recently, we have seen less pressure on the ERCOT reserve margin just due to larger volumes of renewables available within the market. And this has resulted in lower prices and lower wholesale revenues. Of course, weather and available generation, not just ours, but others also impacts our wholesale revenue forecast. But the main point here is that wholesale revenue is very volatile and it makes it very difficult to forecast. Next page, please. So here's another slide that may look familiar. This is also from our fiscal year 22 budget approval request. And again, just providing it here to show you how the different components come together to form the complete revenue forecast. Again, the blue portion of this bar, I mean, it really jumps out, right? It represents electric retail revenues, which are by far the most significant portion of this forecast. The only other component I would like to highlight is, again, wholesale revenue in the green, and that is what we were just discussing. You can look at the historical results and just see the volatility that we mentioned earlier. Okay, so next slide. So before I pass it to Shannon, I think we have another pause here for questions.
Yeah, and I see, Al, your question in the chat. Let me answer that verbally because it would take me too long to type an answer for it. So this is a little confusing. Our budget that we just got approved last month was actually developed in the fall of 2020. Normally, we get our budgets approved in January by our board. We share it in December and spend some time talking through it with them, and then in January they approve it. This year, because of COVID, we were running just a little bit late, and then something huge happened in February and really turned things upside down and shifted the things that we were able to talk to our board about. We only have certain amounts of time with our board each month, and you know, we got to pack that with all the critical things. And so for a number of reasons, that sort of kept getting delayed, and into July, we finally did get it approved. That budget is for our current fiscal year, FY22. Now, as Julie just said, every single time we do a budget, we do a 25-year view of it, right? So that budget that just got approved has this number that says it's projected for FY 2023. But that projection for FY 2023 was developed 10 months ago in the fall of 2020. So right now, we're doing what we call the summer run, which is, I mean, it is what it sounds like. In the summer, we run our budget, and it's about a 3-month process in the middle of the summer to do the summer run. Right as we wrap up the summer run, we start the fall pass, which is the fall version of the budget. And the reason we do that is because every month we learn a little bit more about what the next year is going to look like. So it really is a long process. When we come forward with a request for a rate increase, with a request for more funding to run our business, it will be slightly different than what you're seeing on these slides, because again, this was based on stuff that's 9 or 10 months ago. And I realize that's going to be a challenge for us to explain, but it is explainable, and there's a very good reason for why it ended up the way it ended up, but we recognize it does create some confusion. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, well, it doesn't answer mine because I don't see any reasons that you've given us for the rate increases yet, except for the freeze.
Well, so I can't tell who.
Chad, yeah, I'll jump in. We're going to come forward in this platform or this presentation isn't really speaking to the drivers of cost, but we're going to get into that, at our next board meeting as we talk about some of those drivers. But it really is around supporting our core operations, and those were stresses that we were feeling before the winter storm. And if you'll do us the benefit, we'll come back and share that similar presentation with the RAC in early September as well, and happy to dive deeper into that, and even to the work groups as Reed has alluded to. Thanks, Corey.
I think you could see who was speaking, but that was Corey Kuczynski, our Chief Financial Officer. So, in fact, Shannon, Julie, and I all work for Mr. Kuczynski, and we enjoy every day that he's our leader. So thanks, Corey, for chiming in. Okay, so let's keep pressing forward. Shannon, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. And again, remember, everything Julie just talked about was our revenue forecast, that A bubble. Shannon's going to talk about the B bubble. Shannon, go for it.
Thanks, Chad. So good afternoon, RAC members. As Chad said, I'm going to talk about the B bubble, the revenue requirements. Julie covered the revenue sources. And I'm also going to take a little bit of time and talk about our financial metrics as well and how they play a part in our overall planning process. So we're going to start with this slide looking at our generation planning. And these activities, the key inputs here are really our load forecast. So how much load does our community need? And then looking at our existing generation units and their capacity. The weather also plays a factor here. We look at weather forecasts, our forecast to wholesale market prices, and also any new resources that are coming online. So these are all of the inputs into the overall generation planning forecast. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, this should be a chart you're familiar with. We showed this chart during our budget presentation in July, and this gives you an overview of the overall revenue requirements. And I'm going to spend a little time and talk about each of the components. But the revenue requirements, or the uses of revenue, are laid out in our flow of funds, which is in our bond ordinance. And so when we look at that flow of funds is kind of lays out the sequencing of our spend. So our first bucket is our operating expenses. And so when we're looking at what are our revenue requirements, our operating expenses make up about 60% of our overall revenue requirements. And then we're looking at the payment of our debt requirements. So this is our principal and interest payments on debt that we've issued, and that roughly makes up about 15%. Then the ordinance requires us to place 6% in that R&R account that Julie referred to, which is the repair and replacement account. I kind of consider that as a savings account that we utilize to fund and really reinvest into the organization from an infrastructure perspective. Then we have the city payment, which is up to 14% of our gross revenue. And then anything that is left, which we're hopeful that there are monies, funds left, it goes into the repair and replacement as additional contribution. Those funds are really key, because when we talk a little bit later about our capital program and how we fund that, the repair and replacement fund is our cash source funding for a portion of our capital program. So we'll go on to the next slide. So in developing our revenue requirements, we have to plan what our spend is going to look like for our operations, maintenance, and our capital. So we're looking at our labor cost, how many employees, salaries, benefits. We're looking at projects, what projects are in queue for generation, for transmission, distribution, which ones are capital and maintenance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in some later slides, and what are the costs of our energy efficiency and demand response programs, and then what technology programs do we have, or projects do we have on the horizon. Next slide. And then, as part of our planning, we look at our labor planning. And here we're focused on our headcount, our vacancies. We look at the timing of filling those vacancies. So both occupied positions and vacant positions are changing all the time based on retirements and market conditions. So the team really looks at that. We also consider internal resource needs for projects. So capacity planning, what does that look like? Overtime, employee expenses, and also the cost of our benefits. Those are all factored into our labor planning. Next slide. So then we're planning for our non-labor costs, our operations and maintenance, the non-labor portion. And these are really the day-to-day costs of running the business that really help to ensure we maintain the current level of service. Here we factor in maintenance schedules for routine maintenance. We look at outside contractors where we may have capacity constraints with our own staffing. We include materials, supplies, tools, equipment, maintenance for facilities and vehicles, all of these standard items as part of our kind of day-to-day operations. So these items on the slide aren't all inclusive, but they're really just meant to give you a feel for the types of items that are part of this planning process. Next slide. So the capital planning is similar. Capital spending really results in assets being placed on our balance sheet. So when we talk about a capital item, these items are typically larger ticket items that have a useful life of more than 1 year. And capital spend can be for something new. You can buy a new vehicle, or it can be for a large capital improvement on existing infrastructure if it extends the life. So I always like to use the example, if you build a house, that would be considered a capital asset. If you painted your house, that would probably be a maintenance, an operations and maintenance expense. If you put a new roof on your house, that would be considered a capital asset because it would extend the life of your home. So we apply those same principles when we look at our projects that we have in queue. So as the organization is doing this planning process, the business units are working very closely with our accounting and financial teams to determine what bucket does that project belong in. Is it a capital project or is it an operations and maintenance project? Because they're slightly different, and funding is different because on the capital side, that's where we would issue debt. So that's a very important component of the planning, and so we really do have to have a very collaborative effort. And I would say, too, typically capital projects can vary from year to year, especially in certain areas like generation, where you may have a major overhaul that occurs, and it's only occurring once every 10 years. And so you'll see a variation in that spend, but we also have capital projects that are ongoing projects for like maintaining and improving our system, like leak repair, overhead and underground line work. So those are those type of ongoing capital projects. We'll move to the next slide. And I'm going to pause for any questions. Okay.
I think we've answered the questions that were in the chat, Shannon.
Okay, so we've got all of those answered. Any questions verbally?
Peter, it will impact future budgets.
Yes. Okay. Should we move on?
Yep.
Okay, so we'll move into the next. We'll move to the next slide. So as we talked about the capital program,
I had a question in the chat.
Yes, sir.
Okay. My question was, you had said that the city payment was 13% of our revenues. I wanted to know how that compared to the other large municipal utilities in the U.S., say the top 10 municipal utilities in the United States.
It is significantly higher. We have one of the highest city payments or general fund transfers in the U.S. So I think
so it seems like that's an important figure that our committee needs to understand.
Yes, sir. And actually, as we talk a little bit further into the presentation, I'll talk about rating agencies. And that is something that they do point out. And it is a concern because we do have a high city transfer.
And actually, Ann actually just reminded me that our, not our very first meeting, but our second meeting on June 10th, if you go out to our website, cpsenergy.com/RAC, and look at the June 10th presentation, there's a slide in there that compares our city payment to about 15 other city payments across the country.
And you can see where ours is the largest.
I have a comment on the participation from the city. I mean, several times the CPS people have said, well, this is a nonprofit organization. How do you categorize the payment to the city? Wouldn't that equate to a profit for more or less in a privately held company?
Well, so there's a number of different ways to think about our city payment. They are our owners, so they define it. Let's see, community asset.
Corey tried to answer.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So part of our city payment is a payment that we make because we don't pay tax. So it's essentially a payment in lieu of taxes. You hear things called pilot, but that's only a piece of it. And another piece of it is a return on the investment that they made in us and the return on the investment that we make in assets on the community's behalf.
So, I mean, my point being is that you have to make some money, even on an accounting standard, to pay your maintenance, your pensions, and everything else. And so I think it would be helpful, to have a conversation, incorporate the needed money to run the operations, You know, it's not a nonprofit in my opinion. You know, because the city's making the profit. And the benefits are to the other things I mentioned. And I just think it would be helpful in the conversation to look at it like that. Could be wrong.
As I understand it, the payment also is made in lieu of ad valorem taxes that would be paid for the right of way that the poles have on city property.
Yep, that's another element of it. Part of it is payment to some of the local communities where we have other cities that we operate within, like Chavano Park and
Universal City.
Yep.
Leon Valley, lots of them.
Yeah, a few of them. Yeah, there's a lot of them.
The difficulty I think that we'll see in the future is that it's 14% off the top and not from the bottom. So it's an inordinately large number, which we saw now in the estimates for 22 of upwards of $400 million in fiscal FY22, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I will tell you though, because of our organizational structure, our being a municipal utility, we use what we call the flow of funds, and it's kind of a replacement for an income statement for a taxable or a cash flow statement for a not a nonprofit, a for-profit entity, and it goes in a certain order, a flow.
Right.
We have to cover our operating expenses first, and then our debt service coverage, and then if we have money left over, we pay the city payment. Now, you're right that the percentage is calculated off the top, but if there were ever a year where we didn't have enough money even to cover our expenses, we wouldn't be paying 14%.
That's right.
That gets paid later. But I do understand what you're saying, Jim. I mean, it's right. It's 14% of the top line.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, would it not be important to maybe explain to this group too that the 14% has been a part of the CPS relationship with the city structure for well over a quarter of a century, 25, 30, 50 years? Is that not an important something to impart to this group of how public service of San Antonio became city public service, then became CPS Energy as a part of a municipal relationship? I guess that's what I'm really trying to say. The 14% has been in existence almost in perpetuity. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that is correct, and that's a really good observation and sort of a good history lesson. We were purchased about 78 years ago, something like that now, by the city of San Antonio. And since then, we have, returned a portion of our revenue every year back to the city. And it is a way that our community generates revenue. And as a side effect, the property taxes, the sales taxes that our community pays can be lower because they're getting dollars as an influx from CPS Energy.
Chad, this is Peter. I have a question in line with that. I understand the Alamo Academies has a percentage of their bill that goes toward their funding. How does that factor into the 14? Is that part of the 14? How does it get transferred over to them?
I don't know the answer to that, Peter, but I will write it down and we'll get you an answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up that, I recognize that this is part of our educational session, so I didn't mean to turn this into a discussion now. I just wanted to bring this up as a topic of discussion later, because certainly the city needs to draw some revenues off of CPS. The question that we'll need to discuss later is what's the fair amount? 14%, is that the right amount? It's the historical amount, but when we look at other municipalities, that number is a lot lower. Certainly it shouldn't go to zero, but that's certainly something we need to discuss as we as we move on. It's not really meant for us to dig into deep today, because today's more of an educational opportunity. I just wanted to bring that up, that's something we need to discuss, because it got sort of mentioned in passing that it was 13%, and I just wanted to point out that in my estimation that's fairly high, and we need to again discuss that later and see what we think is fair, and help make recommendations down the road.
Yeah.
Over.
Michael, this is Jim. It is 14%, and right now it's a good third or more of the city budget. So I think we all have to keep that in mind. It's not some incidental number. It's hugely significant.
Yeah, and it may be that that's the right place to be, but it is such a huge number that I think it's something that we need to discuss as we move forward. I don't know what the right number is. I just think it shouldn't be something we overlook and don't discuss. That's my point.
Michael, this is Reed. It's probably the best person that can explain how they've justified this number is Ben Gorzel, and at some point in time, we'll get him over to go through this. It is, you can almost say, as goes CPS, goes the city of San Antonio, because at about $1 million a day, it is more than the property taxes that the city collects. So it is a huge percentage of their general revenue fund. So we will get, we'll either get, probably, I've seen Ben do a really good presentation on this, and it is a very critical point that we're going to have to all understand the number.
Right, and that's my point. We just need to understand it.
And
Yeah.
Ben's pretty good at going through that, and it is something that I think a lot of folks have focused on, and at times attacked. So we'll work on that. That's clearly going to be in group one, and
Yep.
and maybe group two. So thank y'all.
And,
Those are good questions.
these are all very good observations and questions. I do want to clarify, our transfer is about a third of the general fund. The general fund is about half of the city's overall budget. So our contribution to the city's total budget is about 15% or maybe a little bit more. So that's, to me, that's an important nuance, but I wanted to mention that. Okay, let's keep on going. Adrian, if you don't mind, flip on to the next slide here. Where are we?
We're on the finance.
Oh, finance plan, so that's still you.
Still me.
Okay, sorry, go.
I'm still working on, what is the B bubble?
The B bubble, yes.
That's right. Okay, so we talked a little bit about our O&M planning and our capital planning. During this time, our finance team is working to pull together a financing plan. And that financing plan is based on the projected capital spend of the organization. So one of the things that I'll point out is it's an iterative process. So there's a lot of back and forth going on between the teams. So we have that capital budget. We target an allocation for our, to fund our capital program with 50% debt and 50% cash. And that cash comes from that repair and replacement account we were talking about earlier. That is our target. So when we first get our capital numbers, we run those, and then we look to see how our metrics look. And then if our metrics are challenged or they're struggling, we look at, can we fund more with cash, or in certain situations, do we need to fund more with debt, or do we need to cut costs, or as we talked about earlier in the very beginning, when we're looking at revenue requirements and sources of revenue, do we need rate support? So we look at all of those things and we make adjustments to the financing plan. The financing team is also looking at what's happening in the current capital market. So what are interest rates doing? What is the Fed saying? Because that can influence the types of debt that they recommend utilizing in the financing plan. So typically we'll do several iterations on the financing plan to get to metrics that are solid. And we'll talk a little bit more about those metrics in a couple of upcoming slides. So let's go to the next slide. So this is the funding allocations that I was talking about on the previous slide. So again, when we have a capital program for fiscal 22 was $714 million. We were looking at funding that with 65% debt and 35% cash. Again, I mentioned that 50-50 target. If you look at fiscal 21, we were able to achieve that. But in fiscal 22, we're seeing less contributions into the R&R account. And so we're funding a little bit more with debt. So that's those iterations that we work through with a financing team as we're doing the planning. But really the plan, this financing plan is factored into the budgeting process and really allows us to model and obtain a more holistic picture of our financial health. And the team really monitors the financial metrics as we go through these iterations. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay. So why do we focus on metrics? Because they're important, and also they're an indicator of financial health, and our credit rating agencies monitor them closely. Because we issue debt in the municipal market, creditworthiness is important. We have 3 of the major credit rating agencies that provide ratings for us, Moody's, Fitch, and S&P, and they give us a credit score very similar to a personal credit score. This slide just shows you the methodologies and the things that they look at as they score us from a credit perspective. And this is Moody's methodology, and you can see management of generation risk and cost reliability, rate competitiveness, financial strength and liquidity, which is why, and it's 30%, which is why we really watch our metrics. And then the cost recovery framework, which really is focused on what is the rate request process, because the deregulated utilities have to go through the Public Utility Commission. That process is longer, takes longer. We work with our city, our owner, we get approval from our board, and then we go to council. So our process is a little bit more efficient. That's 25%. And then the last part, the willingness and ability to recover costs, is key. This is, are we willing, and is our owner and regulator willing to support us when we need to go to them for rate support. So let's move to the next slide. And these are the financial metrics. I won't spend a lot of time here, but adjusted debt service coverage, which really is just the number of times our cash flow, our available cash flow can cover the debt cost. Days cash on hand is looking at the number of days our operating expenses that we can pay with our current cash, and the debt capitalization is looking at how leveraged we are. So these are 3 of the primary metrics for the rating agencies look at. We'll move to the next slide. And this slide looks at the financial metrics, but what our thresholds and targets are. And as I mentioned, when we do these iterations, we're making adjustments, and we're pulling those strategic levers, which you see in the box to the right. We're looking at financing plan. Do we need rate support, or can we reduce the O&M or capital? So those are our levers, and we look to really solve the overall solution and balance the budget so that we have solid financial metrics. And we'll move to the next slide. So we talked about the credit ratings, and it is a major factor in our ability to get low borrowing costs. And so I wanted to share briefly kind of where we are from a ratings perspective. This particular slide shows under the rating changes, and this is for our senior lien debt, but there's a prior and then a new. So 2 of the agencies downgraded us, Fitch and S&P, as a result of the Winter Storm Uri, and I will share with you a few of the comments that they made on the next slide. Moody's has maintained our credit rating. We are on negative outlook with both Moody's and Fitch, and we're on a credit watch negative, which typically means that they're within a 90-day period will probably take some action. So we continue to work and share information with the rating agencies because, again, the strong credit keeps our borrowing costs low and allows us to do more with our capital program when we have lower interest costs. We'll move on to the next slide. And so I wanted to share just a few of the quotes from the rating agencies related to the recent downgrades, specifically from Fitch and S&P. I think the first one is the key. You know, the negative outlook also reflects the broader economic stress caused by the pandemic, coupled with community perceptions, which could impact City Council's willingness to approve without delay any proposed rate increases. We talked about the city transfer, the city payment. Moody's typically will recognize that we are able to keep competitive retail rates despite that high general transfer. And S&P had similar comments to Fitch. Again, I think we expect them to continue to monitor all utilities, especially those in Texas, as we've gone through Winter Storm Uri, but even with the pandemic. But we will continue to share information with them, share our financing plan, and again, part of the why we do that is so that we can ensure lower interest rates that when we borrow funds for the community. And I think I'm going to pause there. I think next slide is another questions and discussion. So any questions?
I have one.
Yes, sir.
On actually just the last slide, your page 42, it's a different page number that I have here. I guess my concern is just looking at the Fitch and S&P ratings, which is where we got downgraded. You know, I'm highlighting here the broader economic stress caused by the pandemic. That's a system, or what I'll call a broad, you know, what I'll call a systematic economy-wide issue. Did they see any particular reason why we should be downgraded because of something that essentially was system-wide, I guess, in terms of the way we, meaning we, i.e., perhaps our city council has responded to this economy-wide issue? I'm just curious to know, maybe just trying to get a little bit of insight into how you evaluate or sort of think through these ratings as they come from these rating agencies.
So what I will share with you, I definitely don't want to speak for the rating analysts, but what I will share with you is there were a number of utilities that have been downgraded as a result of Winter Storm Uri. I think we have shared our plan and our strategy with the rating agencies. I think we've seen Moody's still, you know, maintain our rating. Again, they're continuing to watch us. It is, it's a difficult situation because when we talk about how the pandemic affected us and we talk about how Winter Storm Uri affected us, we were already seeing some financial challenges just maintaining our operations. And so when you layer on a pandemic and then you layer on a winter storm that had significant costs, it puts stress and strain on the organization. So really key is the ability to get recovery in some format from our community. And I think what we're recommending is, again, to spread those costs out over a period of time to make it affordable. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just, you know, a little bit of additional context on kind of their viewpoint.
I have just a quick question here. Sorry.
No, I'm saying thank you. I do appreciate the response. I was looking for some more context, and you provided it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The CPS provide future data, like what you're showing us, your projection? Does that go to the rating agencies?
Yes, sir, it does. We provide this data to the rating agencies.
Thank you.
I had a question back on slide 38. most of us aren't financial experts, so can you put in layman's term for most of us what the difference is between the threshold and target values so we can better understand what you're trying to communicate in this slide?
Okay, you bet. So
Not on 38. I'm
it's
sorry.
actually, I'm on page 40.
Yeah, Adrian, if you go to, I think Michael's asking about.
He's asking the one with the targets and the threshold. There you go.
There,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I gotta apologize. I'm sorry, y'all. What we did,
Oh, that's
we
the one. I'm
inserted-
looking at my downloaded set. It's 30,
I know,
so
and
the numbering is off. So you're right. It's 40 on yours.
And that's my fault. That's my fault, because what I did is I added some of the question and discussion breakpoints. After Ann sent it out, I said, Ann, I gotta add some more, and so we're projecting one, but you have another. That's the only difference.
Got it.
Sorry about that.
I didn't catch that difference. Sorry.
That's okay. So I'll give a quick explanation. So when we're solving and we're looking at our budget and our forecast, we typically focus on our targets, right? Because threshold is kind of that minimum threshold, and that's where the rating agencies are looking at those metrics. And if those metrics fall below that threshold, that potentially can result in a downgrade. So we're very focused on trying to keep our metrics more in the line of the target, because that gives us a little bit of wiggle room if something happens. And again, we know things happen and there's a lot of uncertainty. So typically when we're planning, we plan to our target. Now there is one issue. The debt capitalization, item 3, actually should be split. It should be less than 60 and 65. No, that's right. No, it is in the right place. No, it's not. It should be swapped. I'm looking at it.
Yeah, it should be swapped.
Yeah, it should be swapped. It should be less than 60 for the threshold, and then our target is at 65. And then you see we also added net income here. Again, I think when we solve, we want to solve to a positive. We want to have net income, but in some instances that doesn't happen. And again, that's where we look at those revenue sources and we look at the revenue requirements. Can we cut any more from the revenue requirements? And if not, then we have to seek additional rate support. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
Yes, that helps. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay.
Okay, these are great questions. I think the last part of the budgeting piece is very fascinating. You know, this issuing debt and the rating agencies, and it really does save our community a lot of money over you know, historically, the fact that we've had one of the highest ratings of all utilities in the country has saved our community a ton of money. And so that last part is interesting to me. Okay, so it's 7:13, and I know we have at least one public commenter, so I'm going to keep going, and I'll try and speed up just a little bit. This last piece is it's what we call the integrated planning process. And it's kind of nice to know, not have to know information, but what this is conveying is that there's a lot of people all over the company that start working very early in the year and finish working very late in the year to do this entire budgeting process. We've got a team that leads the organization through developing strategic priorities, gathering all of the planning information, all of the stuff that goes into the inputs of what you just saw. There's a very lengthy effort of prioritizing the budget. Which capital projects should we do versus which ones should we not do? Which should we do above others that we still think we should do? And that results in business plans. And we do challenge sessions with each other. So we all sit around a table, and there's about 60 people in the room, and all of the C-level employees that we have will challenge one of their peers' business plans. And they ask tough questions and challenge us to make sure that, you know, we've designed it the right way. Flip to the next slide, if you would, Adrian. This just sort of articulates that each piece feeds into the next piece. There's you know, strategic initiatives, there's the budgeting process, there's the portfolio of capital projects that we're going to do. We spend a lot of time analyzing our risks as an enterprise. And then we design our metrics so that we can manage back to that. And then we benchmark against others. So that's part of the integrated planning process. Go ahead and move on to the next one, Adrian, if you don't mind. And then the very last step in this, I think I mentioned this 2 slides ago, is we end up with a business plan. And some years that's a PowerPoint document, some years that's another type of document, but all years it has our priorities, it has our vision, it has what we're trying to accomplish as an organization. This one is a couple of years old, but it's from financial services, and I just pasted some images, you know, to give you kind of an illustrative feel for it. But to me, it's important for you to see that there is this umbrella process that guides from soup to nuts all of the things that this company does and ends up feeding into a budget that defines the revenue forecast and the revenue requirements and tells us whether we got to go cut costs or get more funding through raising rates. Okay, that's it. That's my last piece, I think. Nope, it's not my last piece. Adrian, next slide. Okay. This is an important one too, and I know we do have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. We often get asked the question of how do we make strategic decisions? And this is kind of a crude drawing, a crude visual that is meant to articulate how we make strategic decisions. At the end of the day, it's all about the customer. So if we're considering doing something, we put a whole lot of effort into understanding the impact it's going to have on our customer. The one I got on the page is just a sample decision, but should we retire a coal plant? Well, that is a very complex decision to make, and all of these different forecasting elements come into play. The customer count, the usage, the load, how is that changing over time? And if we retire a coal plant, will we have enough capacity? What would we do instead of a coal plant? We look at ERCOT conditions. That affects the economic dispatch of our plants, which affects the economics of our entire business. We look at the impact it'll have on metrics and the rating agency. Really, all of the pieces that you heard tonight, we analyze. So if we're running a scenario on, should I retire coal plants? We isolate, okay, how much do we think that's going to cost us? What are the benefits I'm going to get from that? And at the end of the day, how much is that going to cost my customers in an average bill? And we'll isolate that to an average monthly bill. It will cost X dollars per month for me to do this strategic decision. So this is illustrative. I use the coal plants just because that is a hot topic. That's a strategic decision that we're discussing. But I wanted to share that. So when we talk about the bill impact that we have on customers, we use a phrase around the halls of CPS Energy. Adrian, if you flip to the next slide, the phrase is total bill. That's kind of one of our mantras, and over the last 3 or 4 years has become one of the most important concepts for our employees to consider. And what that means is, at the end of the day, when a customer gets their bill, anything that we do has an impact on that total bill, not just the price of the fuel or the cost, the regulatory costs that get rolled into them. It is our mantra because it helps us to step back and think globally about all of the different things that impact a customer's bill. Okay, I want to share that with you because I think those 2 slides are pretty important. But I promised you I'd cover them quickly. All right, we're at 7:19, 7:20, and that's, well, let me pause there just real quick to see if we have any questions, but we do have a public speaker, so don't ask too many questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chad. I appreciate you and Julie and Shannon coming in and doing that. We all need to remember that what we're talking about now is the framework, is the process, and we all have to spend a lot of time getting very familiar with the numbers that go into that process and the assumptions that are made behind those. And we'll do that starting in the second Thursday of September. At this time, I guess, Ann, we can turn it over to someone that can put the individual on that we would like to hear from in the citizens to be heard, or public.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Dr. McGuire has signed up to speak. And so, Adrian, if you would unmute her.
Yes, ma'am, will do. Dr. Meredith McGuire, you'll be unmuted now to provide your public input.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
Thank you. At the last meeting of this committee, I emphasized the flaws of basing each rate upon averages, especially historical averages. My emphasis today is about two very important criteria. One is affordability and the CPS Energy's existing rate structure, how it makes problems of affordability extreme. So CPS says over and over that no class should have to subsidize others. But are what CPS calls classes truly classes? By definition, a class is a set or category of things that have some property or attribute in common and differentiated from others by kind, type, or quality. The residential ratepayers' rate groupings do have some attributes in common with each other, but those attributes are also in common with many businesses. CPS rates pile costs on residential ratepayers due to the load that most households have, and to a certain extent also then many of the businesses have similar loads, and that has to do with the fact that the timing of usage is not in the control of the residential ratepayers. For example, residential ratepayers have to leave the house each day, not on their own terms, not on their own choices, but because their job started at a certain time, that their school starts at a certain time, that they have to be somewhere that somebody else expects them to be as part of their job. So a lot of the residential ratepayers are being as efficient as possible in the context of what they've got to work with, but it is not their fault that they are using, that their load was established as something that is a very inefficient load. And I want you to understand that when they are talking about inefficient, they aren't talking about energy inefficiency. They're talking about what's called economic inefficiency. And the fact of the matter is that residential ratepayers have no control over the measures that would make their load be even all day long and be, you know, under their control. They haven't got that. But there are a lot of businesses that are stuck with that same problem. For example, hotels, you know, have the ACs ramped up when people come back to their rooms, or when they're getting ready to go out for the morning and taking showers and turning up the heat or turning down the heat, depending upon what time of year it is. Those kinds of things are things that a lot of businesses can't change either. But because they are all lumped together in the commercial or industrial rates, according to how much they use, they ended up getting their averages built into the same averages that the low load ratepayers are paying. So that in many respects, by trying to put the residential ratepayers in one separate category, and then it ends up being them versus virtually everybody else. A few of the commercial ratepayers also have this same problem. For example, a mom and pa's restaurant or something like that would be equally disadvantaged, although not quite as extremely so, because the commercial rates are shaped differently. But I want you to keep this in mind, though, because the fact of the matter is that those are all tied in with the fact that people need to have water and they need to have electricity, and they very frequently cannot control the conditions under which they have the water or the electricity because of the demands that are made on their lives, by their employers, by a number of other factors. So you have to appreciate the fact that these are ratepayers who could not change it otherwise. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. McGuire. We've got a couple of questions from the committee. If we can save a few more minutes, I appreciate your comments. Those are great. Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. They wanted to allow a few more minutes here. We've got a couple of minutes left. Did some other people have questions or comments? Mimi, I saw you wanted to make some. Do you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that as we go into the working groups, I think there's a lot to digest and to discuss. I think we've raised some of those types of questions that will be coming up, during the working group meetings. I want to find out, I guess this may be a question more for Chad and the CPS team, and you may know also, Reed, how much access, yes, would we have to perhaps maybe use cases or examples or scenarios or some, what I'll call data sets that have not been presented either at board meetings or in other public settings that will be available to us when we begin our discussions in the various working groups. I mean, is that something that, CPS Energy will be available to provide to us?
Well, that's definitely something, as I have talked to many of you about, we see the CPS process moving forward with the methodology they use in group 1, and in group 2, we'll be looking at alternatives to that. So you've kind of got a base case and you've got some alternative cases from group 2, and then you've also got some alternative cases from group 3. So I do see us looking at different scenarios, and we'll see how far we can get with those in the groups. And I appreciate everybody's attention tonight. Appreciate Dr. McGuire's comments. And if we can now, we are at time to adjourn unless someone else has something.
Reed, it's Eloisa. I just wanted to make a quick comment. I think today we were talking a lot about the percentage that goes to the city. And so we were talking about why it went to the city and the history of that. And I appreciate the other member pointing that out. I also just wanted to plug that the city is doing engagement on their budget for the next year. And so to better understand where that funding goes or how it is used, I wanted to plug that for just interest in the city's budget, which is they're talking to community right now under SA Speak Up website.
Thank you, Eloisa. That's very, very important. Anyone else, or did you have anything else, Eloisa?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Ann, Chad, everybody, I really appreciate the work. And the next time we'll see you, we'll be in the working sessions. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks, Reed.
Thank
you. Good night.
Appreciate the discussion tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Reed.
Good night.